Have you ever felt overwhelmed by fear? I definitely have. There's actually a great story in the Bible about this, and it's found in Matthew 14:22 through 33. The story begins with Jesus sending the disciples out to cross over the lake while he goes by himself to pray. While the disciples are crossing the lake, they get caught in a terrible storm. As they fight the strong wind and heavy waves, the disciples grow scared to the point of being completely terrified. During the storm, Jesus comes towards them, walking on the water. He tells them to not be afraid and to take courage because he is there. Then, one of the disciples, Peter, calls out to Jesus, saying, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you, walking on the water." And Jesus says yes. So, Peter climbs out from the boat, his eyes on Jesus. He walks on the water. But then, Peter starts to see the strong winds and the heavy waves, and instead of keeping his gaze on Jesus, he lets the fear of the storm overwhelm him. Peter begins to sink. He calls for Jesus to come, save him, and Jesus immediately comes to Peter's side, grabs his hand, and pulls him to safety. Like the disciples, we can feel overwhelmed by the storms in our lives. We might even be like Peter, stepping out from our comfort zones and actions of faith, but still find that fear immobilizes us when troubles come. I have definitely felt like this before. Growing up, my youth group would often go cliff jumping in one of the nearby lakes. On the drive there, I would feel confident and ready to leap from the highest spot. But when we arrived, I'd walk to the cliff, see how high I was above the water, and in fear, back away from the edge. I would never take the leap. Over time, I worked on this fear by jumping some of the shorter cliffs. Eventually, I decided it was time to jump off the big cliff, the one that loomed 40 feet over the water. I walked up to the edge, looked over at the water far below, and was like, nope, I can't do it. I watched several of my friends jump while I was still held back by fear. Finally, I just ran forward and jumped without looking down and being overwhelmed by the height. And it was awesome. I had finally faced my fear by focusing on what was important instead of being overwhelmed by my surroundings. Fear is a real thing. Oftentimes when troubles come our way, we become fixated on that fearful situation instead of being focused on Jesus. Because trouble has replaced Jesus as the center of our lives, fear is given a space to come into our hearts. So when we grow fearful, we need to fix our eyes on Jesus. He is the only thing that can switch our focus away from the fears in our lives. You can make Jesus your focus in a lot of ways. You can practice this by saying a prayer when you fear. You can practice this by repeating a verse that brings you peace. You can practice this by repeating an attribute of God, like, God, you are good, God, you are faithful, God, you give me courage. Remember that ultimately God will always walk out on the water to lift us from fear when we choose to fix our gaze on him.